Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In the peak season of geopolitics, one of the top policymakers in the world has spoken. I know that there are also serious policymakers in Beijing, in Moscow, in Iran, but they don't always speak. At least they don't write long articles in foreign affairs publication, the magazine. That is what Antony Blinken does almost every year, and that's what he has done now. On the eve of the October 7 Hamas attacks, he's again written this September article. It's a long article. It's also a pre-election article because this is less than 40 days before the next election, before the next presidential election in America. That's a fixed date, no problem about that. Now, what does he write? First of all, he's setting out the agenda of a democratic administration, one that they followed so far, and then also indicating what they might follow going ahead, because this is a democratic agenda. More importantly, he's giving us indications of where America stands on the current global crisis and the global situations. He makes a very important point towards the conclusion of this article, where he says, I am Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, I don't do politics, right? I don't do politics. I do policy, he says. And policy is about choices. And then he lists all the choices. Now, if I read all these choices, it's a long article. I'll share a link with you. In case you are a frequent reader on foreign affairs, you might have a subscription. I think you can read 1 or 2 or 3 without a paywall. Nevertheless, I will share a link with you. You will also see at least the front page on your screens. Now, he uses some keywords. If you see the keywords, and we've done a little bit of a search, then see China. China features 30 times by itself. The most prolifically featuring word is China, 30 times. In fact, if I add 10 times that Beijing is mentioned, you can make it 40. However, there is one more country that's mentioned even more times than China, and that is Russia. So Russia is mentioned 21 times. Putin is mentioned 11 times. That makes it 36. And Moscow is mentioned 6 times. That makes it 42. So 42 for Russia and 40 for China. So you can see where the emphasis is. And then other countries, Iran, for example, is mentioned 15 times. That's also an important one. Now, if you read this entire paper, as I have done, then some things stand out for you. It's a very well-written article. It's a very well-written long article by a very consummate writer that you have to give to Antony Blinken. And he presents to you the American point of view, unabashedly. You don't have to agree with it, but America is the most consequential power in the world. They have the most key role in whatever is happening, the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the US-China relations, what's happening with Taiwan, South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, etc., etc., the war on terror, because it keeps coming back. America is the pivotal power in all of this. So when America speaks, we need to pay attention. You don't have to agree with it. You can argue with it. That's a good idea to argue. So in the reading, I've also picked up some key words and some key letters. For example, the letter C, the letter D, and letter R. Once again, there are many words that begin with these letters that feature several times. First of all, the word revisionist, R for revisionist, that features 13 times. So if you read this paper, you can see that revisionism is the new communism. So if during the Cold War, America's big concern with the other side of the world was communism, now America's big concern with what it sees as the other side of the world is revisionism. And who are these revisionist powers? So Blinken's paper clearly says it's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So this is a quartet. This is a group of 4 which are all revisionist powers. So the other 2 words that begin with R in the same sequence is revanchist, which is used for Putin's policy in Europe, particularly with the war in Ukraine. Then reset, that these forces want to reset the global balance of power and redefine it in their own way. And finally, that there is a need to react to this, and that is something that both East Asia and Europe have now realized, and that is where America's alliances are getting stronger. So those are the R words. That brings us to the D word. Again, he says that these four powers, these four revisionist powers, he's not using axis of evil. That is something that you remember that Ronald Reagan had used, but it pretty much means the same thing. So Blinken writes that these four revisionist powers, that is Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, they are not particularly united by any ideology, which is unlike the Cold War, but they have other interests right now which unite them. They take heart from their belief that America is declining and the Western world is declining as a consequence, that America is divided and the Western world is divided as a consequence. So America is divided, America's allies are also divided. America and its allies are diffident. They are diffident. So this belief set is emboldening them to embark upon those other two Ds, distortionary or disruptive policies, because they see the Western alliance, particularly America, as declining, divided, diffident, and also that their currency, their dominant currency, the dominance of their currency is now under the challenge. That's why you see so much on social media these days, and also on some of the other popular media, that the dollar is in decline. In fact, I find a lot of people in India very enthused by the idea, oh, dollar is declining. So the question I ask them is, maybe it is, but what do you think will replace it? No, there'll be many currencies, or there'll be a BRICS currency, and nothing else will replace it. This is an aside. Blinken is not saying that, but he's implying that if the dollar declines, the only currency that will take its place will be the Chinese yuan. Is that something that we Indians want? That aside, let me get back to what Blinken is saying, because now I come to his third key letter, that is C. C, he lists competition, conflict, the combustible nature of the world, and then the need to address it through collaboration, communication, and then alliances, etc., etc. In fact, in this nuanced paper, he's also giving the Chinese some space. So while he says the Chinese have made their choices going with Russia and with this revisionist group, he also says that America does not see China as an adversary. In fact, he says that wherever needed, America is willing to partner with China. So it's not as if China is a hostile country. In fact, he uses an expression that Biden used earlier. He borrows that expression from Biden and says China is, as President Biden said, a pacing challenge. Now, what's a pacing challenge? It's a bit like when you're in a long distance race. So sometimes some countries might have 3 or 4 runners in a long distance race, and they know that one might be the winner, but others will pace that one. So 3 or 4 can run together and pace each other. That way, competition gets tougher and you might get better timings. The winner gets better timings. So he says that China is like a pacing challenge. It's a competitor in the long term, and we are happy to compete. Now, what is it that he says is threatened by these revisionist powers? He says that these challenge the foundational principles of international system, that's one. And that's why it's important for America to keep its military and technological superiority, its dominant currency, and its unmatched alliances and partnerships. He makes a distinction between alliances and partnerships. For simplicity of understanding, alliances will be like NATO, or the alliances that the Americans have in Eastern Asia with Japan, with the Philippines, etc. South Korea. Partnerships will be the kind that they have, say, with India. In this case, India gets a mention 3 times in this paper. He talks in some detail about American investments at home. And he said when we invested more money at home, people thought we were being protectionist and we were not letting others to come in. But the fact is that America is now the largest recipient of FDI, foreign direct investment, in the world. America is the largest recipient of FDI in the world. It's also the largest giver of FDI in the world, which underlines America's preeminent position in global economy, that it continues. He particularly underlines America's initiatives in bringing semiconductor manufacturing in America, because he mentions in another place that 90% of the world's semiconductor chips are made in Taiwan, which is constantly under threat from the Chinese. And what happens if that production is stopped or the Chinese get control over it? He doesn't say that. I'm interpreting it for you. So he says the success of our efforts in bringing semiconductor building to America is that all 5 chip makers in the world have made commitments to start manufacturing chips in America. This would mean an investment of $300 billion. In fact, if you see the latest Indian-American statement after the Prime Minister's visit to New York, that also mentions a chip-making partnership in India as well. So that's an area of concern for the Americans. Then he says to counter these revisionist powers, we need force posture, intelligence, military strength, and then the combination of sanctions and export controls. As I told you, he gives China some space by quoting Biden to say it's a pacing challenge. But then he also says it's also our most consequential long-term strategic competitor. These are carefully chosen words. Most consequential long-term strategic competitor. And we have to counter its aggression abroad and repression at home. These are very significant words. And then he says that we have to protect America's technologies, while at the same time, we've reached out to the Chinese, we are open to conversations with them, and we've also re-established our military-to-military conversations. He also makes a very interesting point that to stabilize the situation, particularly given that the Chinese are now so involved with the Russians, they've used intelligence diplomacy very effectively. That will explain the visits by the CIA chief to meet his Chinese counterpart, his visits to Beijing as well. So intelligence diplomacy is something which is being talked about more and more now. He says there are 4 ways in which America is trying to counter these revisionist powers. Number 1 is by reassuring the NATO allies, and also by reassuring the other treaty-bound allies in Asia like South Korea, Japan, and also reinvigorating G7. Second, by infusing alliances and partnerships with new purpose. This is where the Quad comes in, and he says we have elevated the Quad. And this is where India comes for its first mention, because he says that with the Quad, he also says that we are strengthening our bilateral partnerships, such as the US-India Strategic Partnership. Then number 3, he says we are trying to bring allies and partners together. So allies and partners, if they are knitted together, they will be a better counterweight to these revisionist powers. And this is where he mentions the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which involves 14 countries accounting for 40% of the world's GDP. Also, he mentions AUKUS in this case, which is the project that America and Britain have to build nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines with Australia. And number 4th, is to build a new coalition to address new challenges. And this is more a motherhood and apple pie kind of point, that get global coalitions for vaccines, for narcotics control, for synthetic drugs control, migration, etc., and involve NGOs and civil society. That's the reason I said this is not so consequential. The first 3 are consequential. Then he says that China's decision to aid Russia underscored the degree to which the fates of US allies in Europe and Asia are now tied together. Until that point, many in Europe had continued to see China primarily as an economic partner, even if they were increasingly wary of relying on Beijing to such an extent. But when China made its choice, remember he said early on that policy is about making choices. He says when China made its choice, that's going with Putin, more European countries now see China as a systemic rival. And then there is an important point about defense spending that I found very interesting. He says that Biden administration has been leaning on its European partners to spend more on defense. And of the 32 partners there, 23 have now taken their defense spending to 2% of their GDP. That's a very important figure, because India for the past many years has kept its defense spending below 2% of the GDP. I suspect this year, however, in the coming year, it might cross that 2% mark, because India's defense needs are now piling up and you can't postpone certain decisions for a very long time. And then he makes the larger point that the security of Europe and Asia is indivisible. And that's the reason, in fact, he mentions that Japanese are making such a big investment in Ukraine's security. They made a $12 billion commitment and they've signed a treaty with Ukraine as well. Such is the concern about China, he says, that when Biden came, because Trump had pulled out of many alliances and also Trump had put Europe under pressure, he says when Biden came, Europe was seeking more autonomy. It was leaning towards getting more autonomy from America and also deepening its ties with China. The situation now is that the same Europe wants to be deepening its ties with the US and de-risking from China. That's a change in the world. And once again, this has led to the realization that Europe's security and Asia's is indivisible. At least that is the American point of view. Now, talking about revisionism, he talks at some length about what's happening in Africa. So he says Russian agents are there in Africa, agents, mercenaries. They are carrying out gold mining of critical minerals. That's causing an imbalance. And there is revisionism across regions. In Sudan, for example, Russians, he says, are arming both sides. And that's a country which needs peace and people are suffering, but Russians are arming both sides. China, on the other hand, is pushing African countries into unsustainable debt. Once again, in Latin America, these forces are supporting a dictator like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. But nowhere else is this revisionism as prominent as in the Middle East. Because he said until recently, Russia was a strong partner of Israel. Now it's become a friend of Hamas. That's a big change in the Middle East. And then in conclusion, titled, Making a Stronger Offer. He makes his sales pitch to the world, saying that, look, Chinese give you debt, Russians might give you something, but we give you more. And that's where he talks about the infrastructure spending or the help for infrastructure or the amount that the Americans, he says are going to raise for infrastructure. He specifically talks about linking the port of Lobito in Angola, please see it on your map, to DRC, that is Democratic Republic of Congo, very mineral rich, then on to Zambia, and then lifting it on both sides to the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, all of this has to be read with the caveat that if Donald Trump wins in November, then all of this will go in thin air. And finally, something that might make headlines tomorrow in the papers in India, because he's once again pushing India's case for a permanent seat in the Security Council. However, if that happens, it will be a very different Security Council, because it will not just be India, this will be India, Germany and Japan. And not just that, there will be two countries from Africa, at least one country from Latin America and the Caribbean, and one small island nation which will be chosen through an election. Could be Sri Lanka for all you know. And one seat, he said, will go to a small island nation which will be done through election. Now, what could that island nation be? It could be Sri Lanka, it can be, maybe Maldives could qualify to be one, maybe Madagascar, or maybe Tuvalu or Nauru, which is just about 11,000 people. So once again, if you look at this, I think this looks like more a rhetorical point, because you don't see this kind of a radical change in the UN Security Council, in the permanent membership so soon. And what India wants is not a new Security Council with 20 members. India wants a new Security Council, ideally with 6 members, where India should be the 6th. So once again, this is a little bit of a lollipop or a soother. We Indians want to be happy. We can be happy because this is a good talking point. This has gone on for 25 years. It can go on for a long time. After this, I don't see any chance of this kind of an expansion of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council.